This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
Gets the stink of oil about him.
All right, welcome into episode 116. This one is titled The More You Know. So on a recent petroleum patrol, I'll call it, I think patrol is fitting because from the analyst position, you never really know what you're going to pull up, at least in large part. The way we organize samples, you at least know if it's going to be aircraft or not. Since aircraft run leaded fuel, we run them in a different lab and we have them, sectioned off that way. But if it's not an aircraft running leaded fuel, then the whole realm of possibilities is opened up. You don't know if you're going to stumble upon a coolant sample or whether it's going to be from a generator or maybe a hydraulic system, a whole wide range. So when you pull up a sample to then write the report, it could be anything. And not only that, sometimes we're left without having any details regarding, what that sample is from, if it arrives with a blank slip. Sometimes people won't want to write anything though, and this is where it can become difficult to produce a meaningful report, which is why at the end of the day, the more we know, the more you'll know when you open up the report. So the situation in question, I looked at a batch of samples where the customer only wrote engine, transmission, or hydraulic. So in this situation, we could at least apply generic averages, but telling someone whether or not it's a good report, a bad one, or better still, what they need to do next, if anything, it's hard to accomplish that without having the details in place. So for today's example, I want to hone in on the transmission in particular. In this case, as I said earlier, the customer merely noted transmission. So we have generic averages up for comparison, but here's the thing. Those are just a baseline to get the ball rolling. Because in truth, while a lot of transmissions can look somewhat similar, they don't really share enough of a consistency across the board where you can firmly state, okay, the system's fine, it's doing well, or there may be a problem lurking here, especially when you don't know other details like how long that oil has been run. So compared to those generic averages, lead was high. Okay, so from there, we might be looking at bearing wear, possibly. However, again, with generic averages, that level may even be normal. And yet another explanation is that it's not a wear metal at all. For example, let's take the twin disc transmission. These are marine transmissions that produce lead, but it's not in the form of any wearing part. This is just oil cooler oxides that will show up in testing. However, it's not anything you need to correct. Therein lies the difficulty from our position of determining whether or not that's a sign of trouble or if it's harmless. This, of course, carries over to generic averages for engines, differentials, whatever it is you're sampling. We can give you a rough outline, sure, but taking it a step further, telling you what health that system is in, and of course, if you need to take any next steps, it all gets quite a bit murky from then on. Now, some of you may be hearing this and thinking, well, you're the analyst, you tell me. And while that's fair from afar, however, when you keep in mind that we analyze samples from literally anything that needs oil to do its job, it can be hard to pick apart the details. For example, an aircraft running leaded fuel, well, lead's going to be expected in the thousands. But if you're looking at thousands of parts per million of lead in an engine, a gas diesel engine that's on the road, well, it probably wouldn't be running, unless, of course, that too is running leaded fuel. Between wearing parts, fuel types, whether or not you're sampling a gearbox, an engine, etc., it's important to fill in the blanks because doing so will determine whether or not what you're sampling has a problem. Now, there are instances, I will admit, where it's fun to do a little bit of guesswork. For example, a seasoned analyst can arrive with little to no details that they are looking at, let's say, a BMW running Castrol Edge. So many BMWs come through here, and with that, we gain a familiarity with the oils that the owners like to run. So it's pretty normal, I would say, to look at a sample and without first checking the slip, see, oh, probably an S65 running Castrol Edge. Not only do we gain a familiarity with the wear metals and, the typical balance they're in for that engine type, the additive package of that oil can stand out, especially because it uses titanium for anti-wear purposes. So all of a sudden we might arrive at that sort of conclusion, also aided in part by things like the viscosity, because BMW owners are typically running a 1060, significantly thicker than, say, a 520 or a 530. But again, sometimes people are running oddball choices, and you can't rule out the possibility of an owner putting in a significantly thinner oil just because they want to. And that can keep us from otherwise confidently stating, oh, you sampled a BMW, looks like an S65, but did you mean to run 520? So what can happen is you might assume that we should know because we look at all these samples, but there are always owners that are making alternative choices, or they'll be using additives that can cloud a conclusion. For example, I can tell you what a 6.0 Power Stroke sample from an owner running like a 5 or 1540 with arch oil, all of that looks very familiar on my end, not only due to the physical properties of that oil, the additive ingredients, the way that those engines can shear the viscosity down, etc. But keep in mind that the elements we test for, they come from different places. And that means that potassium, say in the form of arch oil, is fine. But if that owner is not running arch oil, then the likely explanation of potassium is probably coolant. So you can see where if you send in a sample with no details to test a lab, the responsible thing for us to do is to gain more insight, because having the details in hand, understanding what it is you're running, the context surrounding it, whether it's a break-in sample, whether you're using an additive that can mimic contamination. There's more than one source for pretty much every element you can think of. So therein, it can be difficult to make a snap judgment. And you don't want to make a snap judgment either. In the business of oil analysis, what we're trying to do is help you take care of whatever it is you're sampling. And we'll offer next steps on what to do if we happen to find anything that looks like a concern. So while a seasoned analyst could get a sample with no details and give you some approximations, we want to do more than just give you an approximation. We want to give you the likely explanation that can steer you towards keeping that car on the road, keeping that plane in the air, and keeping whatever it is you're sampling in tip-top shape. Doing so just requires a little bit of paperwork. And I totally understand paperwork is not fun. And also I understand situations where the details simply aren't there. And that's okay too, in the sense that if you are sampling, let's say, a diesel engine oil, you found a bulk supply, but they don't know much else about it beyond that. Well, we can tell you where the viscosity is, what the additive package looks like, whether or not these appear to be additives typical for that sort of oil, whether there's moisture or solids that shouldn't be present. Same with fuel too. Like we run into a lot of fuel samples where, someone may not know how old it is, whether they should be running it, but there are certain parameters across all the applications that we test for where it is easy to give a firm yes or no with regards to serviceability. If it's fuel, for example, diesel fuel, a low flash point indicating solvent contamination, like gasoline, that's going to be a hard and fast rule regardless of the details. Similar story with coolant. If you don't know the details, but you want to know if you should be running that coolant, we can rely on things like the pH, the freeze point, and tell you, no, you shouldn't be running it. Turbine oil is another example where there are hard and fast rules with regards to metal content, solids, water, etc. So this episode is certainly not meant to tell you you shouldn't send in samples where you don't know the details, but mainly to help you stray from sending in samples where you do have the details and merely just kind of want to hold them back to see what that lab knows. Like, I think it would be interesting to find out how direct or firm a lab might be with no details. I guess that maybe it would be fun to see like how wild a lab wants to be, but what we do at Blackstone is tell you about the engine you're trying to take care of, the engine, the transmission, whatever it is, and in a personalized manner, help you keep track of how the data is trending, early indicators of a problem, whether or not this element or that element is a concern. All of that is wrapped up in a comprehensive approach where we're dialing in physical properties, the expectations for a product, averages to show you how an engine typically wears, whether or not you're varying from that, and if you are, why? Because it may be okay if it's a wear-in situation, or if you modified to add power. Whatever the case may be, your engine has its own story. So we're, of course, going to give you a rough outline of what most of those systems may look like, but it's a careful approach of looking at how data trends over time to learn the most about whatever it is you're sampling. So whatever situation you're in, if you're getting ready to send in a sample, just tell us what you know about it. If it's a situation where, say, you found a engine that you want to see if you can salvage, of course, we know that you're not going to have everything as far as the maintenance history and, how many miles are on the oil. You're sending in oil that you just want to know if it's okay to use, or fuel or coolant or whatever it is. If you merely tell us what you know about it, then that can help us a great deal in helping you. But there are obviously situations, like I mentioned earlier, where it's okay to have a broad stroke approach because we can at least look for glaring signs of trouble depending on the application, especially if it's something like coolant or fuel. But when it comes to the oil, we're going to have more to say, more to help you in your maintenance plan by knowing things like the make and model, how long it's been in use, and of course, dialing it in even further with things like modifications or repairs is all the better. In the end, the more we know, the more you'll know about what it is you're sampling. Before I let you go, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. I want to thank all of our listeners for the continued mentions on your oil slips that you're sending in. We're glad to hear that you like the show. Recent mentions from Nathaniel. I hope all goes well with that next sample from your transfer case. Same to Ryan with the DD13. Alan, more episodes are coming, but so are the samples. And so first priority is getting those reports out to you as quickly as possible. But the more time I have for the show, the more episodes we'll have for you. And Joe, thanks for being a longtime listener, and congrats on how good the Honda looked in testing. That's all for today. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.